All right. Okay. Hello. It looks like I'm live on time today. I'm happy with myself because of that. And today I want to talk to you about overwhelm in learning Norwegian because I meet it often, because it's paralyzing, because it's not useful, because it makes you feel really bad. And there are some reasons that might be obvious, and there are some other reasons that are not so obvious but not less common because of that. So I really want to dive into this topic today. Before I do, I want to let you know that I'll be opening courses again after the new year. They won't be starting until after vinterferie, but I'll be opening a pre-sale now. Next week, my courses will be on pre-sale in good packages. So listen up. If you haven't been able to come up with a Christmas gift and your partner has been asking, you can tell them that you want a Norwegian course, or you can get it for yourself. So that's something I really want to get across before I dive into the topic. If you've been meaning to join me for a course, I'll be running both Get Your Norwegian Unstuck and Speak Norwegian with Confidence from after vinterferie. So that's something like mid-February. But they will be on pre-sale now before Christmas, so that's something to know. And from January as well, you can join me for one-on-ones if you want. I have some spots probably from the beginning, and mostly from mid-January there is something that you could book. So drop me a note somewhere, drop me a message if you want to talk about that, and we can look at it like what's best for you. And now to the topic, overwhelm in learning Norwegian. So overwhelm is something that happens to a lot of people. It's not just you, definitely. And it's something that can be very, very paralyzing. I think that's the worst thing. Like, getting a little overwhelmed might be not so bad if it didn't have these consequences, but it does, right? The consequence of overwhelm is that we do nothing or we do very little, or we become very inefficient. And most of my students are used to being efficient, or they want to be as efficient as possible. They don't have time to not be efficient either, right? So this is a major issue. Plus, it really plays on your like self-worth and these kind of feelings. Of course, your self-worth is not dependent on your efficiency. That's I think a common understanding. But if we aren't able to perform not only the way we would like, but maybe not at all, then it gets much more difficult to work with these other things as well. We lose faith in ourselves as language learners. Yeah, we don't believe in ourselves as much. That has implications for our self-confidence, which on the flip side we do need so that we are efficient language learners. So this is a vicious circle. And overwhelm is one of the things that really is like spilling oil on the fire, right? So let's have a look at what I've seen in my students, also in myself, that can be the root cause for overwhelm. And of course, there might be multiple. Of course, there might be other causes for overwhelm, like you might have ADHD, and that in itself might be a major source for overwhelm, right? You might have other things that are personal. We will have a look at what is true for many people, what I meet often. All right, so the first one I want to talk about is this gigantic mismatch between our expectations and between the reality of our lives. And this sounds a little banal, but I want to dive deeper into this and have a look at how these expectations are formed. Because when we expect ourselves to be performing in a certain way, very, very often we would base it on an understanding of progression in language learning that we kind of infer from how language courses are typically structured, right? So we would think, okay, so you start the course at A1 level, and then you move fast through the textbook, all right? And then you have like 1 or 2 pieces of grammar every lesson, and you have these loads of vocabulary. And you might have noticed, I don't know if you did, but I guess you did, if you attended a course like that, that you would have a similar kind of time allocation for each unit, but the number, or like the amount of vocabulary in each unit and the complexity of the grammar varies wildly. But the course provider has to kind of cut the textbook into these, or not has to, but they do it because it kind of makes sense, right? They cut it into these pieces, and by putting the course structure together, they imply that it should take you approximately the same time to progress through all these units. And that's complete nonsense, right? It just does not work like this. But because we know about the structure, and basically like all the courses on the market that you can choose from are the same, in the sense that you just portion the textbook somehow, and you kind of make the promise to students that if you get through the courses, you will learn the things that are in the textbook, which will take you to level X. And we know, all of us, that the reality is far away from this expectation, that the fact that you have gotten through the textbook does not in itself take you to that level stated on that textbook, right? And you know that sitting in that class for an X amount of hours does not even teach you everything that's in the textbook, and let alone the fact that teaching totally does not equal learning, right? Teaching is what the teacher tells you and how they kind of make sure that people understood it, and whatever that these components on the teacher's part are teaching. But whatever happens in your own system, in your head, in your emotions, in your body, that is learning, right? And the teacher doesn't have that much power over that, apart from creating a favorable environment. And if there is an environment of stress or overwhelm, or not being able, feeling that you're not able to ask any questions, things like that, then by creating that kind of environment, the teacher is blocking your learning rather than enhancing it. Yeah. So in this way, the teacher can influence it. But then again, learning is what happens in your head and how you connect the dots from what you had there from before and so on. So this is not linear. Learning is not a linear process, right? It's an interconnected, entangled process, and it's not orderly at all, and it's not linear in the time sense either, right? So the fact that the course that you have attended maybe, or the textbook, is structured somehow, that's just a random fact, right? It's not like you have to understand this thing before that thing just because it's introduced first in the textbook. That has nothing to do with language learning in reality as it occurs in your brain, right? But we kind of expect it, and we expect that because the course provider said or wrote on their website that this course takes you from point A to point B, like for example from A2 to B1. I've attended the course, and then maybe I took norskprøve and I failed the B1 benchmark, or maybe I know it myself that no, I actually did not understand these things, or I did understand the grammar, but it didn't make me a better speaker, and we blame it on ourselves, and we're like, I must be totally stupid because the course is designed by professionals, right, to take me from this point to that point. And I had some classmates who did get from that point to that point, so it must be me. And this, in my experience, not only is it nonsense, right? What our brain generates this kind of interpretation, but it's nonsense on many levels, starting with the professionality of the person who put the course together, because courses, as they are sold in language schools, are not put together to enhance learning as much as possible. They are put together for convenience of the course providers, which makes sense. I'm not blaming it on anybody. Like, from that perspective, this makes complete sense. And I think this is a neutral thing rather than a bad thing. But it's not like this is somehow pedagogically ideal, right? It is not. It's very far from it. So and very often it's just the owner of the language school, or like it's not the pedagogical person who decides how the structure will be portioned. Maybe this is driven by, like, you know, sales in that quarter, that like we can do courses of this length because this fits in, right? So it's not you, you know, like your ability to learn in that time span, and the decision that was at the beginning on the course provider side to make the course X weeks long. Those are different decisions, right? Or those are different things that you haven't been able to cover all that material and implement it in your speaking within maybe 6 weeks of the course. That doesn't mean that 6 weeks was the ideal length to cover that material, right? If I'm making myself understood. So this is why, or some of the reasons why this is nonsense. But together from back from the digression, back to the thing I was saying, is that when we are sitting in the middle of this, we kind of believe that because this professional, whoever they were, made the course X weeks long, then I have to, or I should, or if I was good enough, I would, you know, cover all that material, implement it perfectly, and really like pull myself up by the whole level, for example. This generates a lot of overwhelm in people I've talked to. This is a very common source, that we feel that we are failing constantly. We feel like, oh, everybody else is whatever. When in reality, you have no idea about their backgrounds and what they have learned before, what kind of thinking processes they have, what kind of beliefs they have under that make it possible, that maybe you should fix in yourself first, so that you also open up and make it more possible. You know, it's not about the learning or the ability in itself. But when we're sitting in there, we kind of feel that we are falling short all the time, no matter what I'm doing. Then the course, of course, rushes on, and we're sitting in there and we're like, I don't think I can manage this, right? And suddenly I'm expecting myself to be here, and maybe here, and I feel like this is so wrong, and this causes this kind of short circuit, and I start feeling overwhelmed. And then instead of focusing on what is and just like doing my thing and being like, okay, I'm not going to understand everything in this lesson, but I'm focusing on this thing where I see that there is a chance, we kind of short circuit and we don't take anything from the lesson in the end. Because instead of focusing on this one thing where we felt that we had a chance, we feel like, no, but I have to cover all of it because it's included in the lesson, so it must make sense that it is. Or we feel that it doesn't make sense, right? We kind of understand that the lesson isn't put together in the optimal fashion, but we're like, yes, but what am I gonna do? You see the pace of the class and it just overwhelms you so much because you feel like this is not possible for you. Yeah. And this is a little dangerous, especially if the teacher becomes impatient and starts maybe comparing you to somebody else. Because in reality, being a teacher for many people is an exposed position to be in. They might be unsure about their own abilities as a teacher, right? And this happens a lot because like teachers are just people, right? And what can be happening for the teacher if you say like, I can't keep up with this pace, and the teacher has this kind of order, or like, you know, the bestilling in a way from the course provider, stating that you need to get the students from A to B in X amount of weeks, then they feel like, oh, I must be able to do it, right? And then if you tell them like, this is going too fast for me, they feel like, I can't go slower, or like, am I doing it wrong? Are you telling me I'm doing it wrong because you don't, you know? So the teacher might feel threatened. And of course, this is not your intention to threaten the teacher by asking them to go more slowly. But a number of people would just feel threatened that like, I'm doing my best. Am I doing this wrong? You know, so this might be the emotion that arises in your teacher. And then out of that place, they might even start comparing you to like, but you know what, for these other people it's working, so it must be you, right? And this is so bad if your teacher tells you something like this. I've heard this many times before, that teachers tell people things like that. I really think this is coming in many cases from a hurt place on the teacher's part, as in like, are you telling me I'm failing at my job here? When in reality, the teacher is in a position very often where failing at their job is inevitable because the structure of the course doesn't make sense, right? But this is none of your fault, of course. So saying that you would need it to go a bit more slowly is very legit, and you are right? You are sensing it right. But then if you get this kind of feedback from the teacher's side, maybe, then the overwhelm might add up, that you feel like, okay, am I the only one? Is this really me? I can't really catch up, but I can't do this course 3 times so that I catch up. I don't have the time, I don't have the money, like I don't have the logistics in place. So this, yeah. And going on to the second cause, that's also very, very big, and that's connected to this one, it's another shade of it actually, is when you cannot see the possibility that you will get there. So this is like an emotional cause as well, right? Very, very common that you've been studying, you've taken some courses maybe, and you see that, okay, every time I understand something, then something else will pop up and it gets even more complicated. And I thought I understood, now I don't understand. I sit in the course, we drill the grammar, we do the exercises, I work hard, I hate it, but I sweat through it because I want to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But then you realize that after attending the courses for I don't know how long, you still can't speak in your work kitchenette, right? You still can't formulate the kind of stuff that you want to formulate. And if you ask your teacher on that course that has this fixed structure following the textbook, you ask them something like, how would you say, I don't know, whatever, that you actually would say, yeah? And the teacher kind of shrugs and they're like, you know what, that's a very complicated structure. So based on the grammar that we've done, you can't really formulate that yet. So just like wait and study, right? And it will come. Now, this is a lie that the teacher might not be realizing. It's not like you study the textbook and then suddenly, wow, a light bulb goes on up in your head. And you're like, suddenly I can formulate all these complicated, complex sentences that are enough to kind of formulate my thoughts, right? It's not like that. You won't find them in the textbook. You need somebody to answer that question for you and then maybe explain the grammar in that thing for you. And you'll be very open and receptive, and you'll be able to understand grammar that's like too hard for you because it's in the next textbook, yeah? But it's relevant to you, right? And that's the key, that if you worked in this way, you would get much further in your actual goals than if you just do the textbook, and you're not actually able to transfer that. It's just academic knowledge about the language. And sure, it helps you to formulate something, but it won't help you formulate the stuff you actually want to formulate because it's way too complicated. And it looks like when you're sitting in the course and your teacher tells you something like that, and they do a lot. I've seen that. Like, I have attended courses myself. I've been a director of studies, so I've been observing teachers a lot doing their job and like giving them feedback. I talk to a lot of people who tell me things like that. I've covered for my colleagues, and the students tell me like, oh, you do this thing, can you teach us instead, And like, I'm not saying this to boast, I'm just saying like, people don't need huge amounts of animation in language courses. Adults don't, in any case. They need relevance and they need to be heard, right? They need to get relevant answers for their actual questions. So when somebody is asking me like, how would you formulate this or that? If it doesn't fit in the lesson, I always have the chance to go and tell them how they would formulate it when there is group work. I can just exclude them from the group work and tell them, or I can just approach the group, right? And tell the group, and they are usually interested as well because these are relevant things. And then people have the feeling of actually progressing straight towards their goal. But if it's like random grammar number 1, and the next day random grammar number 2, random vocabulary, you know, of course some of that will be useful, but the transfer is a separate skill. Most people don't have that naturally. The course doesn't teach you the skill of transferring the academic knowledge into practice. And then again, if you worked just by textbook transfer praxis, then it would take you a lot of time. You would need to get to like B2 plus in the textbook, actually really cover everything that's in there, so that, and you would have to be good at transferring on your own part without anybody teaching you, because nobody's gonna teach you in a regular course. So it would take you like maybe 2 years, 3 years, like a lot of time until you really actually learned everything that's in the textbooks, plus you transferred, which is a separate skill, into your own context, and then you practice the speaking in your context, right? So when you think of this, and when you don't see another possibility, right? When you trust your textbook and you trust the course structure and you trust the thing your teacher might be telling you, unfortunately, that like if you study the textbook enough, then one day you will just speak and it will be correct, it will be spot on, you will formulate all the things you need. Well, hell no. Like I have a lot of students who, for example, approach me, they say, I passed the B2 norsk prøve. When it comes to speaking in the context that I need to speak in, I feel like I'm at A2. Like I struggle to formulate myself. I know it's wrong. My textbook didn't cover the stuff that I actually need, like not the grammar, but the specific formulations. How should I put the sentence together? This is like my pet way of saying things. I can't do it. And it can only take like 2 lessons. And I tell them like, this is how you say it. And they're like, I don't understand why the grammar is like that in the phrase. And I'm like, it's because and because. And then we might do a little exercise on that particular grammar. And then they use it again. We get spaced repetition on it and it works. And they walk off and they can use it in practice, right? But if you don't know that this way exists, if you don't know it, if you trust that vocabulary plus grammar from the textbook equals speaking, then you figure out very quickly that if this equation is true, which it isn't, but if you kind of think that it is, you figure out very quickly that to get there to like the desired endpoint, which is the fluency or like being able to formulate yourself properly, right? It would take you like 1,000,000 years, right? And this, getting back from my diversion, I'm very diversive as you can see, but getting back to the original point about overwhelm, if you realize this, and you don't have to realize this consciously, like your subconscious will do it for you, right? And give you that overwhelm before you know what's happening. You're like, okay, so I've been here on the course for half a year. I'm no grammar expert because like this is just not my thing. We don't need to understand grammar deeply to be able to speak. You don't. But on the course, it looks like you do. And I'm like studying these isolated vocabulary items, and I kind of hate it because it's irrelevant. Like I can imagine for some of them that I could use them, but then I'm not sure if I'm using them correctly either. So this is another wrong technique that you will learn in normal courses, that you would study the vocabulary isolated and then like try to put it back together because it's math, right? No, it's not. Speaking a language, it's not maths, but on the course it works like that. And you've been doing it for half a year. The speaking that like comes naturally and it's easy and it's on spot and you can formulate yourself properly, like it's not showing up. And you're like, all right, so I'm motivated to work here. I'm attending the course. I'm doing what I think is the right thing. But if I extrapolate, you know, if I look like how far have I got here, if I look at how much more complex my textbook is getting with every unit, I don't think that I'll get there in my lifetime, you know? And this is a source of overwhelm as well, that you're like, okay, I kind of understand each of the exercises. I can do that, but that's not my goal. Like nailing the exercise, that's not my goal for my career and for my life in Norway. That's ridiculous. But sometimes on the course, it looks like, you know, nailing the exercise must be your goal because that's what you become good at, maybe. Maybe there is something that you don't understand and you're not getting proper answers either. And you're like, with this pace, I'm just like, I'm gonna die still being at B1 level, you know? And when people don't see the possibility, they also lose motivation. I talked about motivation in one of my live streams in the past. I think it was probably the end of November. You can catch up with it. I pinned it in the featured section, both on LinkedIn and on Facebook, so you can catch it up there. Or if you're watching just on YouTube, you can just drop me a note. I can link it to you. I talked about motivation, and I was saying that motivation is not to be found on the street, right? Or generated in yourself by your goodwill and by your skills or whatever. It's not to be found. True inner motivation occurs naturally when you see the value of the thing, like true value. You really think yourself, not like that it should be valuable for you, but it really is valuable for you, right? Plus, at the same time, you see the possibility of getting there. If you don't believe that it's actually possible to really get there in a historically relevant time span, then you're gonna lose motivation eventually. And it's not your fault, it's just natural, because motivation is not something you can create or find or whatever, right? It will occur if you believe that you can get there, plus if it makes sense to you, if you really want it, if it's valuable for you. And so this thing, when, again, based on how your course might be working or the textbook is working, if you feel that before I get to anything that I can apply in my life, it will take 1 million years, then you might get overwhelmed if you're prone to that, because this is just like, this is millions of data points, right? And like, actually, that is, speaking a language is a lot of data points, but you don't have to treat them separately and then put them back together. That's not how speaking works. You can do it in another way that actually works better and moves you towards your goal, and thus motivates you, right? Because you see the possibility. But if you're on the other side, then you might be getting overwhelmed, and then you can't even study properly, because this is not something I wanted to mention at the beginning and I didn't, but you might have heard me talk about the affective filter, that you, when you are in a state of negative affect, negative emotions, it will reduce your ability to take in and to learn, right? Especially to learn for future use, not just like for the test, but like for real life use, for integration. And if it gets too bad, then it gets blocked altogether, that you can't really functionally learn. Anxiety and stress and like fearing the teacher are probably the worst. As adults, we don't fear the teacher. We might get a fair share of anxiety of different types, and we might get this overwhelm. And overwhelm is in this package of emotions that would activate the affective filter, of course, because I think you have the experience that generally, if you get overwhelmed, that's not a good place for you to act from. You can't make good decisions, you can't think straight, right? And you can't decide, like, there are so many things to do, what should I take first? So in the end, it ends up in procrastination and not doing anything. And then we feel that we are failing, and this is a loop. So these two, the mismatch of your expectation and the reality, and for you, like, not seeing the possibility of getting where you want to be and in a historically relevant time span, these two generate a lot of overwhelm I've seen in my students. I have another point that I want to share that I wrote in the invitation, and that's something a little different. That's something a bit more, I would say, physiological, and that's being a highly sensitive person. I'm not sure if you have heard about this phenomenon or not. Approximately 15 to 20% of the general population are HSPs. So this is something very normal. That's something that evolution hasn't gotten rid of, because it has value in society, it has value in communities, but most people don't have the trait. This is a genetic trait that you inherit, so it usually goes in families. That's why it often goes unnoticed, because we feel like, oh, this is the normal level of sensitivity because everybody in my family is like that, right? This is because this is something that's most probably inherited. There is a good book on the trait. If you think it might be you want to read about it, it has nothing to do with learning Norwegian, but knowing this about yourself and knowing how to treat it might be good. For me, it's very useful. I identify as an HSP, and I noticed that a lot of my students have the trait, like much more, maybe like, I would say maybe like 40-50% of my students might have the trait, compared to like the 15 to 20% in the general population. Now, the 15 to 20% that I have that from literature, the amount in my students, that's of course a wild guess. I can't know it, but it seems like that to me, right? So these are no scientific studies on my part here, but I think I kind of attract people like that, which makes sense. But knowing what this is useful. And the book to go to is The Highly Sensitive Person by Dr. Elaine Aron. She's the one who coined the term many years ago, and the book is very eye-opening. So that's a recommendation, having nothing to do with Norwegian, but that might help you more than your Norwegian textbook to actually understand what's going on for you, if this is relevant, and then to kind of adjust. Yeah, you can't really fix it. It's not to be fixed either, because it's a neutral trait. It's useful for many things. I use it every day in my work. It makes the kind of work I do possible. But then again, you are more prone to overwhelm, much more prone, because one thing with being a highly sensitive person is that you sense more things than the general public, than people who don't have the trait. And that means that you have much more input at all times and you get more overwhelmed. So this is not only Norwegian, of course. This is everything. So this is things you notice at your workplace. This is physical sensations. If, I don't know, a hair falls behind your t-shirt and most people don't know about it, you might know about it. I know about it. I need to fish for it and take it out, right? Or maybe like you realize how cold or warm it is in the room. Things like that are completely irrelevant for learning Norwegian, you might think, but they might become bigger distractors for you than for another person. And plus, of course, the Norwegian specific things or the learning specific things will be overwhelming you more than an average person. And this is not a failure. This is your genetic makeup. So this is something really, really neutral if you think that this might be you. And for determining if it is you or not, I do recommend the book by Dr. Aron. It's really good, and it has all these self-tests that you can use to kind of think through it and make a more educated guess. So if you feel that like I'm really easily overwhelmed, there must be something wrong with me. Well, maybe there is something you can fix. There might be other things that might be causing overwhelm that could be got rid of, but high sensitivity as such is not possible to kind of get rid of. But you can adjust for it, you can count with it, and you can be like, all right, I know I am more prone to overwhelm in general when I want to study this Norwegian thing. And I know that if I pull out this massive list of irregular verbs, right, I just faint straight after that. I can't do it. Or I've had students in the past who, for example, when we started talking about grammar, and that was not high sensitivity only, that was also connected to some bad experience from the past. It's rarely just the one thing, right, where things were not properly explained to them, that it was blamed on them, like all these bad experiences we might have. But again, if you have high sensitivity, then the probability that a bad experience will influence you a lot is much higher, right? If that makes sense. So if somebody does not have high sensitivity and the teacher kind of suggests that they must be really dumb because they didn't get this grammar thing when they explained it 3 times already, if you don't have high sensitivity, maybe you won't notice it either, or like you won't care. You're more likely to not notice things or not pick up on emotions in other people's kind of speaking or actions. If you do have high sensitivity, you will pick up all the other people's emotions. You will be more prone to like read in between the lines. You might project a bit more based on that as well, because you are on the watch for these things in a way. If this gets connected to a previous trauma, of course, that's another story, right? So all these things, and I know I'm diverging a long way from learning Norwegian, but this is very, very relevant. People come to me and they're like, I need to finally learn Norwegian. And I'm like, okay, what's the problem? And sometimes they haven't been studying enough, really, because maybe they can't get themselves to it, or they are not motivated, whatever. Yeah. But the point that you are not motivated in the first place, like we said, that's not a Norwegian studies problem. That's a problem somewhere else, right? Or they study enough, they have studied loads, and it just doesn't bring the results, right? And that's more common actually with people who approach me. They're like, I've been working my ass off on this Norwegian thing, I can't see the result, I must be dumb, like, if this isn't working. And the good news is, you're totally not dumb, right? But what is happening is, it is multi-layered always, but it might have to do with your personality makeup, and it might have to do with the fact that you might be highly sensitive, and therefore, if a teacher in the past told you something they shouldn't have told you because it wasn't true, it might have influenced you much more than your classmate who might have been like, what she said, what, like they didn't even, like they didn't even catch it. And it influences you to the point that you might start getting overwhelmed, or you might get blocked. Yeah, you get this affective filter up much more easily than the regular person, right? So this is something to think of. It's maybe not something you would expect from a Norwegian teacher to talk about, but that's my diversions that I think this is very important to have a look at, because like I was saying, most students who come to me for lessons, especially for one-on-ones, tell me things like that, like, I have a problem with Norwegian, but it's rarely a problem with Norwegian. Yeah, if you can't study, then the problem, or maybe it's not a problem, right? But it's somewhere in your priorities or in your motivation, and it might be very fair. Like I was saying in that other live stream that I recommend that you watch about motivation, it might be very fair that you're not motivated because it doesn't make sense that you should be in your situation. But we feel that as the good immigrant, we should be motivated, right? But that's another story. Or the problem is that, for example, you're working hard, but you're getting overwhelmed. And I see that a lot of my students getting chronically overwhelmed with the task are highly sensitive, on top of, other things that might be happening, like the first 2 points, or maybe something else. Like these 3 points, that's of course not everything, but that's something I see a lot. Yeah. All right. A little recommendation with high sensitivity, but it's good for the other points I was mentioning as well. I was mentioning this massive list of irregular verbs. My recommendation is don't do any lists. Yeah, if you know you get easily overwhelmed, don't print out these massive lists. Just don't do that. Instead, get yourself a vocabulary application for your mobile, like flashcards. I recommend Anki, because it's either free for Android or it's a one-time payment for Apple, and you're done with it. Dual cards is also good. Both have spaced repetition algorithm in them, so they save you time and you learn more efficiently. But dual cards is a subscription-based application, so you have to pay for it repeatedly. So I think Anki will be cheaper in the end of the day. But what I mean by this is that if you set timer on it and you're like, I'll just go through my vocabulary for 5 minutes, right, every day, or 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes in the evening. No ambition that I will remember this massive list after some kind of unrealistic time that you come up with based on the structure of your Norwegian course, right? If you do it like that, and then the algorithm throws the vocabulary in front of you, and you just go like, I know this, swipe right, I don't know this, swipe left, and that's all you do. You don't have to memorize or anything, you just go through it repeatedly, you utilize the spaced repetition thing, this has been a game changer for people who get overwhelmed easily, because these vocabulary loads or irregular verbs, whatever this might be, it might really feel like, you open the book and you're like, no, this is just too much, right? The same is maybe believing that you have to read the text in your textbook before you can learn anything. You don't have to. Just throw the textbook away if it overwhelms you, and I know it does overwhelm a lot of people. Just instead spend 150 kroner and get yourself a year subscription to one of these online platforms, or maybe your course even includes that, right? That's connected to the textbook. This is much better than the textbook, and it won't be overwhelming because you set a timer on it and you're like, for 15 minutes now, I'll be doing an exercise. And you don't attach any kind of, I have to get through that many texts, I have to learn all the vocabulary in this text. That's the wrong way of doing it. It's gonna overwhelm you, and especially if you're prone to it. And if you're highly sensitive, then you just have to multiplicate all of this by at least 5, right? So just don't do it. Just throw away the textbook if it's overwhelming you, and just spend the 3 coffees worth on 1 year subscription to the exercises that are online. You have listenings there, and you will figure out what exercise type overwhelms you the least, and you take that as a starting point. So maybe the listening. I feel that the more passive exercises overwhelm us less usually, but you can just listen to the exercises and click for 15 minutes. You can do that, right? And you don't have to, there is no obligation to read the textbook first. You will learn the vocabulary from the exercises. That's input as well, yeah. So that's another piece of advice. Get rid of the lists and put it in an application that will show you just a little bit at a time. And the second one, get an exercise platform instead of the textbook, or in addition to the textbook, and release the feeling that you have to read the textbook first before you can move on, because it won't work otherwise. It will, yeah. And you should know that the overwhelm itself is blocking your learning, yeah. So just getting rid of that in any way possible will be helpful, yeah. All right, I'm getting long here. That's, I think, because I haven't had any live stream for, I think, 3 weeks. There's been a lot of logistics in December and a bit of low energy as well. But I would like to do another one next week. So you are invited. I think it might be on Thursday. I will see how my timetable will be. And yes, I just want to reiterate what I was saying at the beginning, that if you would like to join for a course that has a radically different structure, to the point that I spent the first week explaining it to people, but then they get it and they thrive, I'll be opening courses after Vinterferie, but I'm putting them on pre-sale now when I put the writing together. So if you want to join, or if you want to inquire, if you want to jump on a call to check which one would be good for you, do drop me a note. Just drop me a comment here, or drop me a message, and we can talk it through. I'm putting them in pre-sale packages, so it's gonna be of course much better to get on board now than later, and then starting after Vinterferie in February. And I have some one-on-one spots from January, a few from the start of January, and some more from mid-January. So let me know if you want to talk about that. I have calls to be booked, so do write a message to me. I'll send you the booking link and we can talk it through, all right? So that's what I wanted to say, and hopefully see you next week. If my logistics work out, I'll be here for another episode of Tips for Confident Norwegian. All right, kos deg på Lucia-dagen, and see you next week. Bye bye.